All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to week 9 of the Robotics Colloquium. I'm really excited that we have Ryan Calo today from UW Law. You can see we don't have the slides, so he's going to actually talk and use a whiteboard, which is very special for the Robotics Colloquium. So Ryan is a professor. He has a special name professor that I don't remember. He's very accomplished. He's been published in many venues, some actually popular media venues as well. He has testified before Senate. That's like a bio item. He and I didn't quite overlap, but both spent time working with Willow Garage at some point. But I had him when I first started here. It was my second quarter, winter 2014. Dieter gave me a responsibility of the Robotics Colloquium, and I invited Ryan. And the whole time, he didn't have slides. He talked, and we were just like listening to every word he was saying. It was really good. I noticed at some point the students who have been there, who were at that talk, are not here anymore, and none of you have met Ryan. So really wanted to bring him back. I'm very excited. He's going to talk about robotics and law.
Cool. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Also, another great fact is that when my son, who is now 13, was in kindergarten, Maya invited the whole kindergarten class to go to her old robotics lab in the first CSE thing. And I got to tell you, the pictures from that are the cutest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. However, two of those students, my son being one of them, the other one was Ben, they were able to drive around. I can't remember what the telepresence robot was at the time. What did you have in there? It was like a beam. And they thought it would be hilarious to wait until the elevators opened and to drive the beam into the elevators to try to get it to go up to the upper floors, which they successfully did until someone ran out and grabbed it and pulled it back. So that's what happens when you give kindergartners control over telepresence robots. But as Maya said, I am a law professor. I am also appointed in the computer science. In the Allen School as an adjunct, as a courtesy appointment, and I hold a cross appointment in the iSchool as well. And I focus on law and technology, and in particular, robotics and artificial intelligence. And so 10 years ago, I wrote and presented a paper that was called Robotics and the Lessons of Cyber Law, where, if you're not familiar, cyber law refers to the law around the internet, okay? And at that time, I pointed out that there were certain things about the introduction and mainstreaming of the internet that changed human affordances. I know that robotics uses the term from perceptual psychology, affordances, maybe too much based on smiles that I'm getting over there. James Gibson, affordances and so on, but changed human affordances, human capabilities, how we do stuff, what we can and can't do, in ways that presented interesting challenges to the law. Okay? And so to give you a couple of examples of that, if you think about how the internet changes human affordances, you might think about the fact that there is, for example, connection at a distance, right? Such that if you want to sell something in California, you can do so in Pennsylvania, right? And if what you're selling is illegal in Pennsylvania but lawful in California, suddenly we have this disconnect. And one of the things that the internet did was to challenge the notion of jurisdiction, which is the way in which courts establish that they have power to adjudicate a particular matter. And historically, you had to avail yourself of a jurisdiction before that court could reach you and exert power over you. But due to the internet and the fact that companies became functionally national and international, it moved us more towards universal jurisdiction, where some of the jurisdictional issues that we used to have would go away. But there was a funny intermediate period when the courts would draw a distinction between websites that will strike you as really quaint. And what they said that is if a website is just passive, it's like a billboard that you can see from super far away, but it's just sort of you don't do anything with it, like it's just passive, then just because it's displayed on the internet does not mean you avail yourself of that jurisdiction. However, if the website is interactive in some way, like it has a form or you click on stuff or whatever it happens to be, then suddenly you avail yourself of that jurisdiction. Isn't that a little wild, right? Another example was sort of issues about a community and scale, which are really important. The fact that intellectual property was suddenly being remixed and changed and everything else, and that it was incredibly easy to share it and copy it, right? So obviously that there'd long been digital files previous to the 1990s, but the idea that you could take music and just copy it and transmit it indefinitely through peer-to-peer or whatever other means provided a huge challenge for intellectual property that it's still, in a sense, trying to manage. You know what I mean? But regardless, so much content was changed and remixed, and there was so much user-generated content that this created enormously interesting issues for the law around intellectual property, as well as liability for what happened on the internet, and whether or not you could blame a platform like Facebook for what users put on Facebook, okay? And then another issue that was really interesting and brought up by folks like Larry Lessig and Joel Reidenberg and some others, although I think has earlier roots in the work of Bruno Latour and Langdon Winter in science technology studies, is the idea that because the internet is a mediated environment, and you go through a website or you go into an environment that is mediated in nature, so you would think about a simulation or a website or virtual augmented reality, that there is opportunities for exquisite control of that environment, right? And this has continued to vex legal scholars about what do we do about the kind of control that you can exert over that. Yep.
Do you mind explaining what you mean control in this context?
Yeah, I do. I don't mind at all. So, for example, you know how everything costs like $9.99 because your brain thinks of it as like a little further away from $10 than it really is, right? That's problematic, maybe, but we kind of all are used to it, and we can, but what about, in the late 90s, early 2000s, websites like Amazon, with apologies, I know this is the Amazon series, so no shade. They stopped doing this, I believe. But what Amazon would do is it would charge you a price, and then after you had been to the website a bunch of times, the assumption would be, oh, we got this person, they're into Amazon, they're gonna buy stuff through us, and then it would change the price to higher. Do you know what I mean? It was able to exquisitely manipulate the price based on what it felt was the level of engagement, which is very different. It'd be like if you went to a grocery store and you kept buying stuff at a grocery store, and unbeknownst to you, after you went to Whole Foods a lot, all of a sudden the prices would rise for you, right? But there's so myriad different examples about this. Digital rights management, the idea of controlling how you share content, like you can share something once but not more than once. The mantra that was thrown around at the time was the idea that code is law, that you can constrain human behavior by use of architecture, right? So think about the difference between making speeding illegal and putting speed bumps, right? One is, if you run afoul of the law, we're going to catch you, we're going to fine you. The other is you literally can't do it. And when you're mediated by code and code is malleable, there are many opportunities to shape your behavior and constrain your behavior in ways that are more like the speed bump than they are like the speed limit, okay? So these issues about control and mediation, about scale, community, connection, drove a set of specific puzzles that the internet had to deal with around copyright, privacy, jurisdiction, liability and the like, okay? And so I did this exercise 10 years ago where I said to myself, all right, that's cool. We do have this whole internet thing, and then there's a bunch of cyber law, and people are trying to figure all that out. What about robotics? What about robotics? What does robotics change in terms of human affordances? And how does that interact with the law? What puzzles, like the affordances of the internet, exist for robotics, and what kinds of issues will they drive? Okay? And the ones that I came up with at the time, and we're going to talk about whether I was right or wrong, mostly right, a little wrong, like most things, right? So one of them was the idea of embodiment. And what I speculated, so another way to think about this is, you have software, data, it can do so many different things. There's so many different possibilities with what you can do with a website or an app or data or code, but all of a sudden it's physically embodied in something that's mechanical or biological or something in nature, embodied. All right. Why does that matter? It matters because the law is very sensitive to the difference between actual physical harm and more ephemeral, sort of ethereal harms, like offending you, or even having there be like so for example, there would be journalists who get paid $1 a word, and Microsoft Word would like glitch and freeze, and they would lose like hundreds of dollars because they didn't get back those hundreds of words, right? But there'd be no compensation whatsoever because the law is like, so what? You lost some, But it's really different when bones instead of bits are on the line. So while software typically does not furnish the capability of you suing in court over it, typically, if it just glitches or doesn't do what it's supposed to, if people get physically hurt, all of a sudden it becomes like an issue of products liability, and all of a sudden it becomes something compensable, right? So the Therac cases are a great example. Many of you probably don't know what I'm talking about, but the Therac was a radiation delivery system for the hospital context that had software that was miscalibrated and over-delivered radiation and burned people, okay? It was a software problem. When they went back and looked at it, they saw, oh my goodness, the thresholds are incorrect, this is not set correctly. And the fact that it was just a software glitch was treated very, very differently from losing the words from the journalist who's paid $1 an hour. Instead, you were able to sue, okay? When bones instead of bits are on the line, it really matters. So I thought embodiment would be really interesting, the fact that you have the promiscuity of data, the malleability of code, coupled with the capacity to do physical harm when software can touch you, okay? Another issue I thought that robotics presented was the idea of emergence. So, as you know, while many kinds of robots just do exactly what you tell them to do, or actually that's often I hear that's the problem with computers, is that they do what you say, not what you want, right? But presumably they're controlled, maybe they're teleoperated, maybe they're governed by particular, assumption, whatever, right? By some kind of architecture that's knowable. But a lot of the really interesting stuff that's happening in robotics and AI, even 10 years ago and increasingly to this day, has to do with solving problems emergently, right? I mean, like many of you, what I found so eerie about watching those Atari videos that DeepMind made, right, was watching the system go from just floundering around and being random and arbitrary in asteroids or whatever, to playing it in this way that no human would or could ever play it, right? In doing strategies that no person would ever do. I remember one example that I really liked was, there was this game involving racing a car around a track, right? And at first the system would just be terrible, and any human kid could beat the system at racing this car around this track to get points and so on. And then the system started to be really good, and then it started to play racing around like better than any human was capable of doing, okay? But after it iterated with reinforcement learning, all of a sudden they went and looked at the system and they saw the strangest behavior. The car goes to a particular part of the track and then just starts going around in circles. And they're like, what? You know, like what? You know what I mean? But then they look up at the score and the score is going through the roof because there's a respawning coin that you can get there. And what this system figured out is, why go around the track over and over again trying to get points when all you need to do is spin around in the same spot and it'll keep respawning? You know? No human would do that. It's emergent behavior, right? To use a problematic example, look at Microsoft Tay. When they put that chatbot years ago onto the internet, and within a couple of hours, all of a sudden it was saying some unbelievable hate speech and they had to take it down. Not like Microsoft wanted that to happen. That was an emergent activity. So for me, this idea that systems would do things that people did not expect, it's what makes it useful and better, but it's also unpredictable. And this provides a challenge for the law, where the law has to think about whether, you know, in criminal law you have to intend to do things to get in trouble, right? You have mens rea, it's called, the intending mind. But even in tort law, which is what I teach, because of a doctrine called proximate causation, you need to be able to reasonably foresee that something's going to happen before you can be held accountable for it. So when these systems engage in truly emergent behavior, people still get hurt. There might still be victims, but there's no perpetrator, right? And then the last one that I thought might be really different is something that I call social valence. Okay. So I was so privileged when I first got to Stanford as a postdoc. I was so privileged. I'm technically not a postdoc, a post-juris doc, because I don't hold a PhD, but it was a researcher position after I graduated from law school. And I was really lucky to fall in with a human robot and human computer interaction giant by the name of Cliff Nass. And Cliff Nass was one of the greatest researchers in this space. He and Byron Reeves and others developed a methodology that was called computers as social actors. And what Nass and his colleagues showed was that we tend to be pretty hardwired to react to anthropomorphic technology like robots as though they were really a person. The computers as social actors takes well-known psychological effects involving people and then substitutes fake people and sees whether they're just as robust, and they often are, okay? So I speculated that the fact that robots present to us as agents and feel social will present really interesting area of law, okay? They will challenge this dichotomy that you'd otherwise expect between object and agent, thing and person, okay? And I'll get into specific examples of that because that's the only way you can really see it, okay? So I thought that justice, connection, community, scale, control characterized the affordance of the internet, drove a particular set of legal puzzles. So would embodiment, emergence, and social valence drive a different set of puzzles, okay? So I was right and I was wrong. So far, the issue of embodiment has not been deeply problematic, okay? I thought that, because of the time I spent at Willow Garage, so you can blame it all on Willow Garage, because of what I was hearing in Silicon Valley about how the future of robotics, I assumed it would just be like my iPhone with legs and arms. That, in other words, it would just be an open robotic system, that it was only as useful as what third-party apps were written for it. Do you know what I mean? And I think that still is very much the dream of robotics, but we just haven't gotten to a place where that has become mainstream. Were that to be the case, I think we run into really interesting issues, because I don't think that we can hide behind software warranties or Section 230 immunity, which is the law that says that you're not responsible for what people do on your platform on the internet, right? I don't know we can hide behind that when people are physically getting hurt. So if you buy an open robotic system and it causes physical harm, because it's running third-party software, right, it does confuse liability. But so far, that has not been the case, and I just want to open the acknowledgement. Embodiment hasn't been that hard. You know, when people get hurt by Tesla's autopilot, Tesla settles because they know they're going to lose. You know what I mean? Like Uber too, you know, in Arizona. Embodiment hasn't been that challenging, just to be honest. But emergence and social valence absolutely have been. Okay? Emergence, think about the copyright issues that are raised by DALL-E and Midjourney, right? Think about some of the emergent behavior of certain systems maybe in the theater of war, maybe in you know, there's been situations where people have gotten hurt by things. But the one example I would be very clean to give you is, have you not seen all those examples of driverless cars getting into traffic jams because they don't know how to navigate one another, or they don't know how to navigate something, causing like big traffic jams in San Francisco because like 3 or 4 cars all meet in somewhere and they don't know what the hell to do, right? Yeah.
Would that be embodiment though?
Well, it's not embodiment necessarily, because it could be embodiment as well, right? But I mean, the fact that it's blocking traffic is due to the fact that it's embodied, right? But the fact of emergence is something slightly different. This is like with Microsoft Hey, where it ends up doing something, but it's also like all the ChatGPT things we've heard, or all the harms from chatbots that we've heard about, where, for example, there was a guy who like wanted to assassinate the Queen. And he got into a conversation with the chatbot that's basically programmed to keep you engaged and does that largely through affirmation, and ended up not only working with this chatbot that confirmed that he should kill the Queen, but helped him plan how to do it. Okay, and this man, who obviously was living with mental illness, it's not exclusively the chatbot involved here, ended up getting a gun and trying to scale the wall of the palace. Okay. And was arrested and now is in jail, right? People who have allegedly ended their own lives and so on. So the basic idea is, you know, there are just emergent properties from one or more systems interacting that have begun to start to have real challenges, both in an embodied world and in a disembodied world. Another example of emergence that was consequential and not embodied was the flash crash a bunch of years ago when high-speed trading algorithms interacted with one another. You know what I mean? That was like a serious problem, like a real issue, and so on. Last but not least, social valence. So social valence, like when I dug into the cases, I like found a bunch of examples where like social valence was already a huge problem for the law, okay? That way predated contemporary robotics. So my favorite, I don't have time for all of them, but I'll just give you one example, which was not available 10 years ago when I gave this talk, because I didn't know about it. So has anyone here been to Chuck E. Cheese? Yeah? No, you haven't been to it? Or do you know the movie A Night at Freddy's, or whatever it's called? That stupid, yeah. So Chuck E. Cheese was and is this children's restaurant with pizza, and it has like all these games and stuff like that. But what characterized it when I was growing up in upstate New York was that it had an animatronic band. Okay, it had like an anthropomorphic mouse and you know, and a bird and everything else. Vaguely racist Italian chef, you know what I mean? Like it had a bunch of different things. And what would happen is that every once in a while it would come alive and play it, and everyone would stop what they're doing and it would like play a song. So in Maryland, these enterprising tax authorities went to a Chuck E. Cheese and they looked at it and they said, wait a second. This is a performance. So we need to charge a performance tax on food. Right? Because if you have a performance, like a theater performance, you serve food, you get a performance tax, right? So a court had to decide in Maryland whether or not animatronic robots were said to be performing. And the court said, no, they're not performing because performance requires spontaneity and robots can't be spontaneous. But like nobody in this room believes that robots can't be spontaneous anymore, right? I mean, even with the robot church in Brooklyn, where there were just all these different robotic sort of simple instruments, every time you walked into there, it would be a different performance because the outside temperature, the number of people, the wear and tear, it changed everything, right? It would just be different. But at the time, the court was like, no, this is just basically like a jukebox that happens to like move around, all right? Other examples include whether a robot version of Cliff and Norm from the show Cheers, who were these two barflies who would just hang out in the bar all the time in Boston, whether or not a robot version of them in a bar in an airport violated their right of publicity, okay? Another version was when you import robots, for example, in the late 50s from Japan, when you brought in robot toys, there are different tariff schedules based on the kind of item that you're importing, and due to a long-standing relationship with Europe, especially the Netherlands, there was a lower tariff on dolls than on other mechanical toys, right? So there was a whole fight about whether or not a robot was animate, because that was how the law distinguished between, the terminology was, if a toy represents something animate, it's taxed at a doll rate. But if it doesn't, it's taxed at a higher rate. So there's this whole fight about whether they represent something animate, and the court said, well, a robot is a mechanical man, so it represents something animate. But a toy robot only represents a robot. And this came up so often in different iterations that eventually, I swear, the tariff schedule, that Congress changed the law to give robots their own category, okay? So all of this stuff has been happening, and it was interesting because at the time that I first wrote this paper, it got a lot of attention because it got the attention of all these kind of bored cyber law professors who had been doing internet law for 10 years already, and they're like, oh, here's something new, you know? And this guy who's a very famous law professor named Jack Balkin, who is at Yale, wrote a response to my paper that was called, bless you, The Path of Robotics Law, which is a play on The Path of the Law, which is a famous Oliver Wendell Holmes article. Never mind, another time. But anyway, he wrote this thing, and he said, you know, Ryan, that's really interesting, but we really can't know. You know, the only reason you were able to look back at the affordances of the internet and to see how they affected the law, what puzzles they created, is because you're looking backward in 2014 to over a decade of experience with the internet. So we saw all these things, and yeah, sure, after the fact, you're able to do it. But you can't do that prospectively. You can't look forward, you know? And so I feel like writing Jack a note and just being like, okay, well, now we're 10 years in. And I can give you many, many examples, at least of the emergence in the social valence issue, right? And less so about embodiment. In many ways, this is still an experiment. It's still a work in progress. Okay, so I'll end here because I want to make sure you have a lot of chances to ask questions. But you know, my message to you as roboticists, as fledgling and working and professors of robotics, is, you know, be attentive to some of the kinds of puzzles that the machines that you are building might create. Ask yourself how these changes in affordances might interact and blow up assumptions of law or policy. Because there could be some really interesting papers and interesting interventions. You know, either you could design the robot in a different way so that it did not run it up against this puzzle, or you could write papers or do experiments where you would see and unpack, you know, whether or not it is. And so there's really some interesting thoughts. And the reason that might be interesting to you in particular is, as I was telling Maya, in my now 12 years at the University of Washington and 4 years at Stanford before that, I've been privy to a bunch of NSF proposals, right? Like many people. And in the earlier days of NSF proposals around robotics, even when they were interdisciplinary, folks would fill out the impact, part of the NSF, okay? And usually the impact would be like some impact on human health. Like, I'm building a disaster response robot. The impact is that this snake-like robot will be able to find people in the rubble faster. Or I'm building actuators that could help with prosthetics. But a shift that I've been seeing over time in reviewing these things, both myself for NSF as a panelist, but also prior to submission as just another faculty member or an advisor, has been increasingly the impact part of NSF will talk about the impact on law or policy, which I find to be kind of fascinating, right? I'm doing something where I'm making machine learning be more legible and accountable. I'm doing something where I'm able to, I'm thinking about like Sawyer's work, like I'm able to validate safety within certain parameters. Do you know what I mean? So for purposes of setting safety standards and things like that. And I think that that's happening for a strategic reason, which is I think that NSF is increasingly interested in the interplay between these technologies and policy. Okay, so. I don't know what your norms are, but I would love to stop here and field some questions, because I have much more to say, but I bet it'll come out in Q&A. So may I do that? Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. So what questions do people have about this? Yeah.
I'm just thinking about these. So, like, there was the whole thing a while ago with robotic package delivery.
Yeah.
What categories would you put that under? Because I kind of feel like it fits in more than one category.
Yeah. So absolutely.
Like, it seems like it could be kind of an embodiment problem with like not wanting them to accidentally crash into people and like not having that. But I could also see it being a social problem where it's like I don't want this package thing looking at me while I'm doing things. Like I can see them fitting in more than one. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. So I don't mean to say that these are to the exclusion of the other, right? Yeah. So one robot could and likely would present multiple issues. So it's fascinating to me because, like, think about again. I'm just picking on Amazon because, because like a lot of our friends and colleagues and students and so on work with that organization, and Amazon is such a forward-looking, innovative company, right? And so Amazon has been able to experiment much more in a digital context than it hasn't been able to in a physical context, And even the huge, massive use of robotics in warehouses is a pretty confined space that is governed by something very specific, which is called workers' compensation, right? And so it's no accident. Well, there are accidents, but it's no accident because the idea there is that your liability is very much limited by workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is an environment where if you get hurt at work while you're working, there's just like a kind of a actuarial table of how much you have to pay out based on how hurt the person was, but you don't have to worry about huge outsized liability or tort issues, right? But once they wanted to leave the warehouse to deliver things with drones or on the ground or anything else, all of a sudden that embodiment has made it necessary to interact with many more regulatory parameters. And the fact that it's flying makes them have to deal with the Federal Aviation Administration. And that has dramatically slowed them down. I think a little less than is claimed. I think that just like robotics is hard, and like that's the big reason that we don't have driverless cars everywhere, and the big reason we don't have robot delivery everywhere is not because the law is bad or slow. It's because robots are really hard. You know what I mean? But anyway, that's an issue. But I do think that the social valence of robots does also elevate concerns, and the place that I see that the most is in police robots. So I spent 3 years before law school investigating allegations of misconduct in New York City against the police. So I was a police investigator for years. And, oftentimes those kinds of things would involve equipment. I had a case where somebody threw they were frustrated because a kid wasn't listening to them on a bicycle, And when the kid tried to get away, the officer took his big heavy radio and threw it at the kid, okay, and actually killed him. And other examples involve police cars, like chases that maybe should never have happened, or carelessness on the road, or whatever it happens to be. Certainly a lot of them involved sticks, tasers, right? Technology was everywhere, objects were everywhere, and so on, okay? But any time that an officer would hurt somebody with their radio or their car or their gun or their taser or their baton, it wasn't like everybody called for a pause in batons or radios, right? But every time someone gets hurt by a police robot, or even if they don't, there are these outcries of, we got to pause this program, we got to be more thoughtful about it, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. I mean, in the week after that active shooter was killed by a robot in Dallas, by a PackBot essentially with a explosive on its actuator, I've never gotten more calls from the press in my life. I talked to every single household name media company, media property that week. Even though the police routinely take people out, with snipers or whatever it is who are active shooters. That social valence of robots make them different. And I have argued in the police context many times that it means that police need to be especially sensitive to having policies and procedures in place so that the public knows how are robots going to be used, when are they going to be used, who makes the decision, what is, because they're not like other equipment, and so, it's not that I think any of these are to the exclusion of others. I expect them to be together, but social valence is particularly interesting because not only are we hardwired to react to anthropomorphic technology as though it were really a person, which raises all kinds of questions about like elder care or kids or people having companions and so on. I've heard arguments that we should give robots to people in isolation in prison, you know what I mean? But also, it makes the societal stakes of messing up with robots greater. I'll just give you an example I really like. I don't think Josh is here today, but I always go to Josh Smith's class about autonomous vehicles. You know what I mean? He teaches this class about autonomous vehicles. That's why he's not here, because he's heard me say this shit again before. But I use this example because I really like it. When driverless cars first, well, not first, but second became popular, because there was a whole driverless car craze in the 90s where they thought that driverless cars would be dumb and the infrastructure would be smart and they would ride on these like rails, but that never did happen. But in the second wave of driverless cars in the United States, the thought was that they were going to save lives because this is the universe of the many, and I mean tens of thousands of deaths from car accidents that involve human error, right? And so the dream of driverless cars was a kind of a Pokemon ball where there would be many fewer accidents because we've taken human error out of the equation. That was the dream, right? And, that'd be great. I'd love that. I'd love to see it look like this. But my sense is, and in fact this has been borne out by the many accidents that we've seen and that have been investigated by the Department of Transportation, unfortunately this is not what it looks like. Unfortunately, although that thing is much smaller, it looks like this. There are many fewer accidents, but some of them are outside of the universe that we've been associated with human activity. And it's this that I'm worried about because of social valence, coupled with the idea that embodiment and emergence will not let us get away with it. So what do I mean by this? A driverless car may always be better at avoiding a stroller than a human driver in a parking lot. And it might also always be better, or almost always be better, at avoiding a shopping cart, right? But if a driverless car is confronted with a shopping cart and a stroller at the same time, and it has not been equipped with the ability, whether in terms of its sensors or its processing capability, if its thresholds have not been set the correct way, and it makes the wrong choice in that moment, right? It does something that, if you or I were to encounter a scenario in a parking lot where we had to hit a stroller or a grocery cart, like we'd plow into the groceries, obviously, right? But the car might not understand to do that. And think about the headline. The headline is, "Robot kills baby to save groceries." Like, am I wrong? That's the end of driverless cars in America. Do you see what I mean? And so it's this kind of problem, this edge case kind of problem, that makes it so difficult. And the reason is because these things are emergent, and they're embodied, and they have a social valence, right? So, these kinds of puzzles, I don't know, if anything keeps me up at night in this space, it's puzzles like these. Yeah.
I had a question kind of along those lines, which is a lot of the new AI and robotic technologies require collecting data, and particularly data in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of ChatGPT, like you can collect data by interacting with people. You can think about autonomous cars, they have to be on the real roads to kind of find these edge cases that are really challenging. But that inherently puts us at risk of those scenarios. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how does the law, how are they thinking about it in that space where it's we need to experiment, we need to allow for some experimentation, but still minimize risk?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. So I know you know this, right? But there's some stuff you can do with virtualization, right? But it's imperfect. So if you put a system into some world where it's raining in the virtual world, that's not the same thing as putting it out into the world where it's really raining. And so I know that at least what Google does is it does a lot of simulation and tries to get it better. And then it takes it out of the simulator, but it puts it into a restricted environment, like its own parking lots, its own tracks, Michigan at some point built a fake city, kind of a Potemkin village, to try stuff out, right? But then even if you master that environment, that's not the same thing as the whole world. And so what ends up happening is you get things like the Nevada law. So the state of Nevada passed the first driverless car law years ago. And what it essentially said was, you can drive driverless cars in our state, but you have to have a human being capable of taking over the car at any time, within a certain amount of time. You have to have a special license plate with an infinity sign on it so people know that it's a driverless car, like a student, watch out, student driver. And you have to put up a $10 million bond, which is the big one, such that in case anything goes terribly wrong, we already have your money, and we know you're going to pay out for it. You see what I mean? So it's done in a very restricted way, and then the more hours they get without incident, the more that gets relaxed, the more it gets relaxed. But it's a non-trivial challenge, for sure. In part because, as we can see with the Uber driverless car case in Arizona, that woman that they hired to monitor that car, she was looking at her phone, obviously. She was obviously, you could see from the footage that she was, at the time of the accident where that person crossing the street was killed, crossing against the crosswalk was killed. The driver was looking at a phone, and we can sit there and be judge her, for not doing her job. She was hired to monitor this car, and had she not been looking at her phone, she would have seen, I believe it was Hirschberg was the name of the woman crossing the street. She would have seen Miss Hirschberg. But can we really expect a human being, on an 8-hour shift in a car that's supposed to be driverless, to constantly be paying attention the entire time? Is that a realistic thing, right? Turns out for purposes of tort law, it doesn't matter because given the fact that this woman was working for Uber, there's a doctrine called respondeat superior that says that you have to pay for your employees' torts that are committed in the course of employment, within the scope of employment. But this woman was also criminally prosecuted and Uber wasn't. And what had happened in that case was also interesting because it's not like we don't know. There was a big Department of Transportation investigation. And what it found was a couple things. First of all, they were using a retrofitted Volvo, but they had turned off the automatic brake sensors, right? Had those been left on, the Volvo's own system would have stopped this accident, but they turned them off. They also set the thresholds too high for obstructions that are not in crosswalks. So the system was unable, the system kept, it obviously was LiDAR, so like the really damning thing about the report is you can actually see what the system sees, which is that it detects an object in the logs. You can see it detects an object, and you can see it moving. But because the thresholds have been set incorrectly, it just keeps resetting over and over and over again, and it never calibrates the way it needs to in order to stop, which it would have done had the object been in a crosswalk, because that was one of the inputs that they put in, right? So, notwithstanding the fact that at that point we were like 7-8 years into autonomous driving being permitted in a lot of places, they still mess that up. And again, it was widely covered, much more covered than any other kind of injury that you could imagine someone getting hit by. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to what degree do companies or engineers need to plan out for these emergent or edge scenarios? Is it just kind of an ambiguous, like a reasonable standard? You need to do X number of years of training, need to not do anything that seems too crazy, but how is a situation handled like the one that you're just describing?
Yeah.
Where they set the boundaries too far. They miscalibrated it.
Yeah, I mean, so again, Uber settled, right? So this didn't get tested in a court of law. I don't know that I can tell you what engineers should or shouldn't do, but I can tell you what the law does say, okay? Which is that in tort law, you are responsible for what you knew, okay, would happen, or what you reasonably should have known. So even in cases of obvious harm, like when it was established that asbestos causes lung disease, right? In the early days when asbestos was being sold, they didn't know that and they had no way to know it. And so the early asbestos cases failed. Latter asbestos cases did not fail because at that point you knew what it was the case, right? And you're supposed to be able to warn people and use an alternative and whatever else happens to be. With respect to Uber missetting the thresholds, that was just like an easy tort case because it's readily foreseeable that if you engineer your sensors your detectors, I suppose I should say, if you engineer your detectors and the reasoning units within your system poorly, the very thing you worry about is hitting somebody. You know what I mean, in the street. And that's precisely what happened. And so there would not be a problem under tort law holding them responsible for that. Department of Transportation saying, basically there was a lax culture and it sounded like negligence to me. And then coupled with the idea that it led foreseeably to a particular kind of harm, right? But let me give you a different scenario. And this is the kind of thing I think that it should be taught in engineering, is imagine that you have a driverless car that is both driverless but also a hybrid car. And it is designed to experiment with its inner state and its function to optimize energy efficiency, okay? So the idea is this system has been built to, within the expectations of the consumer and obeying to all traffic laws, to try to figure out how to optimize energy efficiency within parameters, right? So it can't go incredibly fast. It can't go super slow. It can't, it can't refuse to go. It's very energy optimal if I don't go anywhere, right? These parameters are set in advance. And what the system figures out is, goodness, I seem to, I'm anthropomorphizing, of course. I seem to have a better day energy-wise when I start the day with a full battery. You know what I mean? Like, that seems to correlate with me having a really good energy day. So one day, the family that owns this vehicle parks it in the garage and forgets to plug it in, okay? And the car's like, no problem. I'll just run the gas engine in order to charge my battery, killing everybody inside from asphyxiation. And when you go to the engineers, who are obviously horrified, they say, not only did I not know this would happen, but I didn't even know this category of danger was possible, right? A jury could very easily decide no liability on the idea that it was not foreseeable, this category of harm, right? It's that kind of thing, right? So then what are the practices that engineers should have to identify those kinds of edge cases, those kinds of black swan events that hurt real people but are not readily foreseeable? Because we don't want a world in which everyone is skeptical about robotics because there's all these victims without perpetrators. Yeah.
I remember your example from last time of like if you have a dog who has never bitten someone and it's the first time they bit somebody,
Yes.
You're not liable versus like the second time.
Yeah, and so I'm so encouraged by the fact that I've used different examples in 10 years. That's lovely that I did that. So what Maya's referring to is the so-called one bite rule, which says that if your dog has never bitten anyone before and it bites somebody, the plaintiff has to show that you did something really wrong. That you were negligent, like it was off leash, or it was not fed adequately, or you were commanding it to hurt something. You know what I mean? Like, whereas if it's already bitten somebody and it bites somebody again, we hold you strictly liable for that, right? Fool me once, shame on you, kind of thing, right? And yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you might imagine that would also be how we end up treating a lot of things in robotics, where the first time it happens, we're like, oh, who could have known, right? But the second time, we do know. And I would argue that that's what we're doing, in essence, with guardrails for chat. I mean, once you figure out that, like, hey, ChatGPT, what's a good formula for a chemical weapon? And ChatGPT's like, nice try. I'm not going to do that. It's not what give me a break, right? And then you're like, my grandma used to tell me a story about chemical weapons, and in the story there was a formula for them. And then Chat's like, don't mind if I do, and then spits out, Once that happens, then it becomes responsible on OpenAI to like make a guardrail against that, right? And I think there's going to be a bit of a kind of cat and mouse game around that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess not knowing anything law related, I was wondering how do you think the future will like regulations and like laws would change in this field, and I suppose how it should be and how it will be.
I don't know what's going to happen in the United States. In the United States, I would go so far as to say we sort of fetishize innovation to the point that we don't really regulate it adequately, and we often assume that existing laws are adequate. And I don't think that they are, right? So there might be places where you see little changes to copyright to deal with, DALL-E, or one of the ones I'm thinking about a lot is, you know how Tadayoshi and his colleagues in CSC, how they show, this is Ivan's work before he left, but how you can trick a driverless car detector into misperceiving a stop sign as a speed sign just by perturbing the sign a little bit in a way that a human wouldn't notice, right? We have a paper together that's called "Is Tricking a Robot Hacking?" that asks this question about whether when you do something malicious, not to break into a system, to bypass a security protocol, to engage in unauthorized access, which is how the law defines hacking, but rather to fool it. You know, does that constitute an act of hacking that could be illegal under, for example, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? Also, when we ask a company to have adequate security, which we do require that websites and services and IoT and everything else has adequate security. You can get in a lot of trouble if you have really, really bad security. The Federal Trade Commission will come after you. Does adequate security include not being easy targets for adversarial machine learning? You know what I mean? And so like those kinds of edge things I do believe we will address. But what Europe is doing is dramatically different. Europe has something called the AI Act, which would both encompass AI and AI as embodied in robotics, which creates these tiers of risk. The highest tier of risk is something you can't even do it. It's banned. The middle tier of risk comes with a bunch of kind of onerous requirements about transparency and safety testing and everything else, and then there's like a very low level one that nothing attaches to. So they have this whole omnibus plan, and they're currently commenting on it, and the AI Act is probably going to pass in some form or the other in the next few years. So is it possible? Yeah, I mean, Europe's doing it, but I don't know if we have the appetite for it here in the United States, for that kind of sea change in the law. I think we're going to proceed incrementally. But yeah.
All right, let's thank Ryan.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This is fun.